It's Dana from the Hardin County Extension Office, and we are back for this month's library video. If you've been following along, we've been doing different kitchen appliances, and we decided this month that since we couldn't do in-person canning classes, which I would love to be able to do, that we would do a question and answer session with canning instead. And so we've had you all submit questions for about the last month. We got some really good ones in, and so I'm just going to kind of answer those. I'm going to do it a little bit different because I feel like you get tired of seeing my face, and I don't just want to be a talking head. And I don't want it to be something where you have to go back and listen to everything that I say to get your one answer. And so I've broken it up into a graphic presentation instead, where you'll actually see the questions that we got asked and see the answer. I'll expand on those answers as I talk, but you'll see a clear and concise answer to each one written on paper. So that'll help you as you go back through if you need any answers as well. I will stop a couple of times and just do some closer showing of something or anything like that. But for the most part, I'm just going to answer the questions that got submitted today. So thank you to all of you who submitted questions. That does not mean that if something comes up or does not come up in this video that you need answers, that you can't get that answered. So please don't hesitate to contact me at the Hardin County Extension Office. Our phone number there is 270-765-4121. And I would be more than happy to answer your canning questions, troubleshoot whatever it is that you need. You can also find us on Facebook. It's the Hardin County Cooperative Extension Service, and write a comment there or send us a message. And as always, I'm going to be monitoring the comment box here as we do this video. And so I will be answering any extra questions that you may have, or if you need clarification on something that I say, anything like that, please don't hesitate to ask. The point of me being here and doing those is for you to get your questions answered. So I want to make sure that that happens. So like I said, this is a little bit different just because I didn't feel like just me sitting here talking was going to be as helpful as it could be. So I did make it into a more visual presentation, and we'll get that started. Thank you all for watching. I'm just going to kind of move through these, and I'll expand a little on the questions that you see and the answers that you see, but for the most part, the answer is there and concise. So first question I got was, how long are home canned goods safe? I get this question a lot, and it's a fun one to answer because technically, if foods are preserved properly, they're good indefinitely, which is one of the benefits of home canning. But we do see a decrease in quality after time, and so we say to consume your home canned goods within a year for optimum eating quality. Proper storage is a huge key in this. So if canned foods are stored in a warm place, or even if it's somewhere that is cool and dry, but it happens to be near pipes that sometimes get hot, or a furnace or a range or any indirect sunlight, then they can lose their eating quality even in weeks, but definitely within months. And so on the other end of that, dampness may actually corrode your cans or lids, and cause leakage, which will result in spoiled food. So proper storage is huge in this. We want cool, dry places that don't get a lot of that direct sunlight. But your main thing to look at is try to eat those foods within a year for that optimum quality as well. What's the number one reason canned goods go bad in a short time? So hopefully we don't see this a lot, but we do see this some. But good news is all the ways that, or all the reasons that canned foods can go bad, they're avoidable. We tend to see, again, with improper storage, with some slight mishaps within the canning process. We see some improper seals, but a lot of the time whenever I figure out people's canning issues, I realize that the main reason is that the food didn't reach proper pressure for a long enough time. And so if a recipe calls for 10 pounds of pressure for 20 minutes, and it's been at 10 pounds of pressure for 15 minutes, and that pressure happens to drop, I see people that will build that pressure back up and then continue on for 5 more minutes. And unfortunately, if that pressure drops, you have to build it back up and then start your timer over. So the way that canning works is that it's getting that heat at that amount of pressure for that long, and that's whenever you can ensure that your product is a safe product. So it's not 20 total minutes, it is 20 consistent minutes, and that's important when looking at a recipe. So how can we be sure that things are safe after canning? And this is one of those things that it is a tricky answer, but we just trust the process. And so if you use recipes that are from research-based sources, and they've been tested for safety, we have followed all proper canning procedures before, during, and after canning, then there's no reason you shouldn't have a safe product. One thing that I always like to point out, though, is that just because a blog online got a seal to form does not mean that the food actually reached a safe internal temperature that was needed to kill the microorganisms that cause foodborne illnesses. So make sure that you're getting your recipes from USDA, National Center for Home Food Preservation, Cooperative Extension, maybe a So Easy to Preserve or your Ball Blue book. But make sure that you are following the ingredients and the processing times. I also see a lot of times where people have a fun family recipe that they want to preserve, and that seems ideal. But your best bet is to find a recipe that's similar, that's been research-based and tested, and can that. It's even funny, on the National Center for Home Food Preservation, they even mention that there are recipes that they love within their family, that there's just not a proper way to can it. And so unfortunately there are some recipes that it just doesn't work out. But find one that is most similar to what you're looking for, and can that. And then we just say that properly sterilized canned food will be free of spoilage if the lids seal and the jars are stored below 95 degrees. But if you're looking for really that retention of quality, you want to store your jars between 50 and 75 degrees. And if all of those things follow suit, then we can ensure that the canned foods are safe. So what can be safely canned without a pressure canner? So there's two differences to point out here. There is a pressure canner and a boiling water bath. And so if you don't have a pressure canner, maybe you're just getting started in preserving your food and you're a little leery of pressure canning, which I totally understand, then you may want to start with a boiling water bath. And so I'll show you here in just a second after I answer this question the difference between the two. But I also get the misconception a lot that you can just use one or the other. They're almost interchangeable, and that is not true. It has to do with the acidity level of the food, so the pH of the food. So high acid foods and some foods to which acids have been added, so things like pickles and some of your tomato products, are safe to process in a boiling water bath. So fruits, tomatoes, tomato products, pickles, relishes, salsas, jams and jellies, and then more things than that. But you're really looking at foods that have a pH of 4.6 or above, or again, those foods that have an added acid, like pickles, tomato products, things like that. Now, this does not mean that if you want to can your green beans, that you can just add vinegar, add some sort of acid, and then that makes it acceptable to process it in a boiling water bath. That is not the case. It's only those foods that are kind of right on the line, which is where our tomatoes fall, that we add an acid to ensure that it reaches that safety point. So technically our tomatoes should have high enough acid, but the way that we grow them now, we produce so much more on a smaller plot of land, and so they're not as acidic as they used to be. And so we always add an extra acid, lemon juice typically, to ensure that acidity makes it safe for a boiling water bath. So I'm going to show you the difference between the two types of canners now, and then we'll go back to answering our questions. Okay, so this one is a little bit tricky because the question is, what pressure canner do you recommend? And actually in extension, and even if I wasn't in extension, I would not be able to just tell you right off the bat one brand that works, because you really do have to choose the canner that works for you, that works for your family, and that works for your kitchen. But even on top of that, Extension can't recommend any specific brand because there are honestly many reliable, trusted brands on the market. But there are a couple of things that you want to look out for. So the USDA will only recognize canners that will hold 4 quart jars on a rack or more. Typically, you don't even see ones that small. 16 quart canners tend to be the smallest ones that we see used. Presto, American, and Miro are brands that are used frequently. They're used safely. We see them a lot when recipes are tested, things like that. But one thing to point out is, and again, a reason that I would not recommend a specific brand, is your stove plays a huge role. So if you have a smooth top stove, there are certain canners that are not recommended for use. And it's not even one brand. It may be just one of the models within a certain brand or a couple of them, things like that. And so make sure when you purchase your canner, or if you've inherited a canner or you've got one at a yard sale or anything like that, that you find the manufacturer's instructions for that exact make and model of canner that you have, and make sure that you can use it on a smooth top. So there are instances where the smooth top stove cannot handle the pressure, and it has to do with the bottom of the canner having the correct ridges and things like that to know if it will work for your smooth top stove. So again, just want to point that out. I can't, even if we could recommend a specific brand, I wouldn't, just because it really has to work for your family and your kitchen and your needs. So along similar lines, I got asked about what brands of lids do you think are most reliable, and it's sort of the same thing. There are tons of brands of reliable lids on the market, but I do want to point out a couple of things. So when choosing your lids, you've got to make sure that they are 2-piece screw top lids. We want them to be the flat metal lids, and then you want to make sure that, and I'll kind of point this out, the 2-piece here, this is the ring, and then this inner piece here is the lid. And I'll show you one in person in just a second, but the bottom of this lid will have a colored gasket compound around the bottom edge, and that is what actually, when heated, forms the seal. You can reuse rings, you cannot reuse lids. And so that's another thing that's very important to point out, that as long as your rings are free of rust and in good condition, you can reuse those from year to year, but lids are one-time use. Another thing to point out is that if you haven't purchased new lids in a while, and you're purchasing some new ones this year, there were a couple of changes to some brands. I know Ball has made changes to their lids. I'm not sure of if any others have, but we always have had to preheat our lids to get that gasket compound ready to seal. That is no longer the case. And so those can just be popped right on after you have prepared your cans, or your jars, I mean. And actually, we've seen some issues that if people did preheat them like normal, they're actually not getting a proper seal. And so make sure if you purchase new lids that you be sure to read the box and see what it tells you about preheating those lids, because that is changing right now with some of the newer lids that we see on the market. So I'm going to show you lids really quickly, and then we'll keep answering questions. So this is one of those 2-piece lids that I mentioned. So this is our ring. These are reusable as long as they are free of rust and in good shape. This is our lid. You can see it has not been used before because it is a flat metal lid, so it's going to be ready to make that seal. And then that's our colored gasket compound. It's kind of rubbery, feeling a little sticky almost, and that's what's actually going to form our seal when heated. There are no approved canning recipes that use 1-piece lids. You've got to make sure you have a 2-piece lid with the metal screw top like this here. All right, this is a fun one. Are there any electric pressure canners on the market? And notice that that does not say pressure cooker. That says pressure canner. And up until recently, the answer to this was no, but the answer now is actually yes. There are a few electric pressure canners on the market. Ball has one. I have used it once before, the Fresh Tech automatic home canning system. And then I also saw that they have a new water bath canner and multi-cooker, kind of an all-in-one piece of equipment there. One thing to point out with these is that most of the recipes are for very small batch, high acid foods. So if you are trying to do multiple quarts of your green beans in a day, like you always have, then this is not for you. If you're trying to do 4 jars of a high acid food, so some of your tomato products or jams or jellies, then maybe this would be something that would be worth looking into. It also does do potatoes, but again, small batch, so something to consider. And then I happened to see while looking through this that Presto recently introduced a digital pressure canner that does claim to meet USDA standards for processing low acid foods. I don't know a lot about it, I will be totally honest. And so I'm excited to see if that plays out to being a good piece of equipment on the market. But it does say that it does meet standards, and it will do low acid food. So if that is the case, that's a new piece of equipment that we haven't seen on the market yet. So now, here's the difference in the words there. Can you use an electric pressure cooker to can? And plain and simple, the answer is no. There is even one on the market right now that right on the front of the box, it says you can use to can your foods, and that is not true. So the USDA does not currently recommend using any pressure cooker to can, even if it says on the box that it's okay. So only pressure canners have been tested and approved to reach safe internal temperatures needed for food preservation. And there actually is a difference. So pressure cookers, electric pressure cookers, are smaller in diameter, they use less water, and they tend to have less metal than pressure canners. And those are all really important factors in determining the processing times of a recipe. And so that is why they have not been tested and approved to use our recipes and reach those safe internal temperatures. So again, even if the box says it's okay, currently there are no pressure cookers that the USDA recommends for pressure canning. So now we're going to get into some of the specifics of certain types of foods in the questions that you all had. So first up, can you can cherry or grape tomatoes whole? Absolutely. We tend to see it less often because they are an indeterminate variety of tomatoes, and determinate varieties create a large batch in a short amount of time. And so typically when we see pressure canning, we see large batch canning, because if you're going to get it out and do all the work, you want to get it all done at once. And so determinate varieties that give you a lot of tomatoes in a short amount of time mean that all of your tomatoes are good quality and ripe together at the same time. And so it's easy to do those large batches. Cherry and grape tomatoes are indeterminate, which means you don't get as many at a time. And so it's harder to do those large batches. And so that's just why we see it less often. But it is totally doable. Another thing to point out, if you do want to preserve them, but you are more of a large batch person, is that cherry and grape tomatoes are great dried and dehydrated. So that may be a food preservation option for you as well. Does salsa need to be pressure canned? So tomatoes are always one of those tricky things that they kind of fall right on the line of proper pH to go into a boiling water bath. But again, I mentioned earlier that in tomato and tomato product recipes, we add that extra component of acid, and so that makes it safe for boiling water bath. And so salsa is one of those tomato products that we do not put in the pressure canner. There actually are currently no pressure canning process recipes for salsa, just because they are a mixture of low acid and acid foods, and they do kind of fall on that line like tomatoes do. And so use an approved salsa recipe. Again, this is one of those things that unfortunately it's tricky to use the family heirloom recipe. Find an approved salsa recipe and then process it in the water bath. I actually got a couple questions about salsa. So another one is, my salsa recipe is mostly corn. Should it be pressure canned? Because again, this person is thinking that acidity level is not there. And then another question that I got, and I just combined them into one, is, are there any options for freezer salsa? And so the salsa recipe that's mostly corn, unfortunately, and I've mentioned this a couple of times, your best bet is to find an approved recipe that is just similar to what you're looking for and what you traditionally use. And then again, it's going to be water bathed. So it is unfortunate that we can't just take our favorite family recipes and adjust processing times and figure out a way to pressure can it. But since it is so crucial that we kill those microorganisms that cause our foodborne illnesses like botulism, it really is important that we don't just take our favorite recipes and figure out a way to can them. And so I mostly see corn as a relish when it's processed. And so one thing you may want to do is freeze that salsa instead. So that's still going to preserve it. It may affect your texture a little bit, but not horribly. And so that's why I put those two questions together. Are there any options for freezer salsa? Absolutely. Salsa can be frozen. And if you don't have an approved recipe, then that is actually what we recommend that you do. Next, I'm wanting to use last year's canned vegetables to make vegetable soup and can that soup. I worry that canning again will overcook my vegetables, so how many minutes should I can the soup for? And this one is a tricky question. So there's a couple of parts to it. Typically, vegetable soup recipes that we see for preserving use fresh ingredients. Can you use last year's canned vegetables? Yes. But then the next part comes in of it absolutely is going to compromise the texture of those vegetables, processing them again. But unfortunately, on the minutes that you should can it for, it seems like maybe you could just, since those things are already processed, that you should be able to just lower that time. But what it is you're opening up that can, and those vegetables, even though they were previously canned, they're being put into a new recipe. And so everything in that recipe has to be processed and brought up to temperature together. And so we could not make any recommendations for a lesser amount of time. And so if you do choose to use previously canned vegetables, you will have to follow the same recipe as if they were fresh. And then just know that the ingredients, the texture would absolutely be compromised. So one thing that it maybe would be a better option would be to, say you were putting green beans in the vegetable soup. I'm not sure, but go ahead and make your vegetable soup with your other fresh ingredients and just leave out that green bean thing. And then combine the two before you serve it. But for your best option for canning vegetable soup, it's going to be to use fresh ingredients. So. All right, do you have a safe recipe for potato soup? I love potato soup, and so I want to answer yes, there is a great way to preserve it for you. But there actually are no current recipes for pressure canning potato soup. And this is likely because of the thickeners that are found in potato soup, usually milk, flour, things like that. They're not recommended to be canned. So, good news is if you want to preserve your favorite potato soup, you can freeze it. So. When canning a mixture of things like vegetables or fruits for jams, how do you adjust the processing times? And again, this falls into, I feel like a broken record a little bit. This is just one of those things that unfortunately we can't play around with recipes too much. You've got to use approved recipes and make sure that you're reaching the temperatures and the pounds of pressure and everything that are in those recipes. And even things at it sounds like you should be able to just swap out. Like, I don't want to use green beans, so I'm going to put in more corn, or I'm going to put in more carrots, whatever it is. But even changing proportions of different vegetables, that's going to alter the amount of time needed to reach that safe internal temperature. And so for that reason, we can't recommend that you create your own mixed vegetable recipe. There are several approved recipes for mixed vegetables, mixed fruits, and mixed fruit jams and jellies. And so the best thing that I can tell you, and sometimes my job is not always fun. I don't always get to tell people, the answers that they want to hear, but find the one that is most similar to your needs and can that one, and that's going to give you your safest end product. And again, when we're looking at preserving our food, we want to do it safely. First of all, we don't want to spend the time and the money to preserve a food that doesn't give us a safe end product, because then that's just wasted. And second of all, we don't want to get sick and we don't want to make our friends and family sick. And so it is the hard news sometimes of that recipe cannot be canned. Or a lot of times my job is, here's what happened in my canning process. Something went wrong. Can I save it? And I have to be the one sometimes to say, no, you're going to have to toss it. And that's hard for me. But my goal as an extension agent is to make sure that you and the people that you're serving food to are safe. And so this is how we get there. So we are almost done. And I saved this one for last just because it is a fun recipe. These people attended a class that we had at the extension office, and we made strawberry jam. And so she asked if I could please share the recipe again. And one thing to point out is at this class, we used the Ball Jam and Jelly Maker, which if you have not seen that appliance, if you do small batch jam and jelly, it's awesome. I will admit that. I'm not promoting it at all. But it is a product that we do have at the extension office for test purposes, and it has worked out really well. And so if you have a jam and jelly maker, we in that class used the reduced sugar recipe, which you see there. But if you're just wanting to can strawberry jam traditionally, then you would use this recipe right up here. And then you would stir to your little heart's content. So I say that because if you are canning traditionally, you do have to stand and constantly stir as you bring that jam and jelly to a boil. But then you're going to load your jars and process those in a boiling water bath. So that one thing to point out, the jam and jelly maker is for small batch canning. It doesn't do a bunch. And so again, it's just choosing what's right for your family. And then last thing is I just wanted to say thank you all for playing along, for submitting those questions, and I hope you learned something today. If you have any questions at all or follow-up things that you need, please don't hesitate to contact me at the extension office. Thanks you all. See you next month.